Katherine.
Hi, Annie. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Well, here, let's start off by introducing ourselves. I'm Annie Lowrey, and I'm a staff writer for Slate.
And my name is Katherine Mangu-Ward. I'm a senior editor at Reason Magazine.
Yeah. So we are here in the midst of what can only be described as a somewhat ridiculous news cycle in which all lesbian bloggers have declared to be old men, and Anthony Weiner is the subject of the day, and we just had the first Republican debate. So yeah, what was your overarching reaction to it?
So I have to say, when I was watching the first part of the debate, I actually had a moment of hope that the presidential campaign season was going to be about the economy and about issues that actually matter and that are, of pressing concern. And then we went to the first commercial break and we had whatever the first one was, Conan or Leno, and that sort of signaled the beginning of the end. And after that, we had candidates, contradicting themselves. We had this sort of long, sad slide into social issues where all the Republican candidates just tried to be more conservative than the next guy, and a sort of continued refusal to really address foreign policy in any serious way. Much more discussion.
Got like the last 4 minutes of the debate.
I mean, much more discussion of don't ask, don't tell than the fact that we're still at war in a couple places around the globe. So I guess hope springs eternal in my heart, but then it was all over. What was your response?
It was basically the same. I mean, I think with these debates where they have so many people on stage, obviously at the very beginning, these debates are always somewhat useless. You can never get anybody to say anything for more than a couple seconds. And, basically the thing that I kept on focusing on during the debate was poor John King continually trying to interrupt everybody and kind of like softly hooting throughout everybody's answers. And, the economy stuff was there was a lot of it. I think that you saw Newt Gingrich kind of actually give the attack that Republicans will use on Obama during the campaign, and it's a fairly compelling one. The economy is awful, and Barack Obama has continually and rightly said, well, there's going to be road bumps, and this is the biggest recession since the Great Depression, and it's not going to be permanently uphill. But at the same, permanently going well. But at the same time, the economy is really bad, and I think that Republicans will play on that very, very well. And that was the point where I thought that they sort of sounded strongest and clearest. But then once you get into the details of, we could fix the economy by ending the Federal Reserve, and then we would have 15% GDP growth, things got a little bit silly.
And that's actually Newt Gingrich's terrible fate, right? He is the guy who has perspective, who has kind of this bigger view, but unfortunately it's virtually always lost in the thicket of his disastrous personal life, his sort of no filter between brain and mouth problem. And I have a sort of long-standing secret love of Newt Gingrich for I guess all of those reasons, but I thought he did pretty badly last night. He wound up seeming kind of doormat-ish, even when he was as you rightly note, kind of saying the thing that Republicans will probably ultimately say.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that Romney was a clear winner of the debate. I thought that Palin came off like a very, very wishy-washy. I was somewhat surprised by how sort of, soft a lot of his answers were. I thought Herman came off somewhat ridiculously. And so, and the other thing I would note is it seemed like the only actual substantive debate that they had was about the space program. And then that debate actually got cut off really quickly, and virtually everything else they were either agreeing with each other or like not really disagreeing with each other in kind of a weird way. So, and I thought that a lot of the answers were kind of, somewhat ridiculous. It was fairly substance free, and I guess as these big debates always are. But yeah, in terms of the economy, what I thought was a little bit worrisome was I thought that there was a kind of interesting walk around to the Ryan plan, and then the sort of accusation that Democrats don't have any plan to fix the economy at all. And I don't think that that's entirely accurate. I think that Democrats do have a plan, but they couldn't get it through Congress. And it was actually Gingrich, I think, again, who gave the kind of reasonable answer to another question about how realistically, when you're moving things through Congress, what you need is, for both parties to be led by the same party for both houses to be led by the same party. And short of that things are hard to move. So again, I thought that Gingrich gave reasonable answers, but I agree with you that he seemed a little bit sour. He didn't seem like he was happy to be there. It didn't seem like he was sort of commanding in the same way that Mitt Romney was commanding.
And he didn't have that odd childlike joy that Ron Paul always seems to have, especially kind of in the last third of these big debates. He suddenly kind of gets giddy and starts, hitting on his favorite topics, which, as you note, are things like getting rid of the Fed. But he has this kind of this joy, this excitement about the debates, and I think Gingrich was on the other end of the spectrum. But with both Palin and Romney, they just had so much to lose that there was this a little bit of almost paralyzed with fear thing, especially about Palin. He just didn't want to mess up so badly, and
I think that led him to mess up. Right. Yeah, and I thought that Bachmann came off very, very well. I think that she really shines in these sorts of debates, which I think it'll be interesting watching other people respond to her, because she gave very, very exactly the answers that you would expect her to give, but in a very warm-seeming, very sort of populist way. I thought she came off really, really well, actually.
There's actually been I think this is the second strike in a weird, maybe Bachmann isn't the worst person in the world moment that I'm having, and I suspect other people are having it as well. The Wall Street Journal last week ran a profile of her in which she appears to be this sort of spectacular, wonky, I read von Mises on the beach gal, and there's no trace in there of the kind of amateur hour Tea Party feel that she brought to the last election cycle, or the, I think, she became a YouTube hero for some pretty wacky questions during hearings, things about global currencies and things like that. And she seems to have just scaled that all back, at least for this week. I assume that if you are the kind of person who really genuinely lays awake nights worrying that a global currency is coming upon us, you can't keep that down forever. That's going to bubble back up as the campaign cycle continues. But I think she's having a fantastic week. So
yeah, I think so. And I do wonder if and I don't want this to come off condescendingly, because my point is not that Michelle Bachmann is stupid, because I do actually think that Sarah Palin might be stupid, but I don't think that Michelle Bachmann is. And I don't mean to draw too many comparisons between them, because I think that they're sort of, overlinked in people's minds for the kind of obvious reason that they're both women and they're both, from these kind of Western states and whatever. I think that she's gotten really, really good advice. I think she's honestly really studying this stuff, and it's very different running for president than it is being in Congress, and it's very different being in Congress than it is being a state legislator. And I think that she's actually making that transition really, really well, and sort of, developing a set of opinions about these things and really studying up on it. And I think that that's something that Sarah Palin really horribly failed to do, which is actually just to kind of do the homework that it takes to be a campaigner on a national stage. And so, yeah, I think that she's very formidable. I was very, very impressed. And I agree with you that, and I don't know whether it's that sometimes she just kind of says these things and doesn't necessarily know what she's saying. Some of her answers sometimes absolutely terrify me. Her opinions about the debt ceiling, I think, are completely and utterly wrong. I think her understanding of monetary policy is, as you mentioned, just frankly bizarre. And obviously a lot of her personal politics are almost exactly opposite to my own. But I think that she's really doing well in terms of being a campaigner. And so I'd be interested to, see if how that plays out going forward, because she does just seem so confident in relation to a lot of the other guys up on that stage who really, they seemed so timid and so afraid.
Yeah, well, and again, this may be a kind of nothing to lose situation, right? If the world sees her as a slightly crazier but maybe slightly smarter Sarah Palin, you're starting from a pretty low bar. So, and I think she actually brought a kind of Ron Paul-esque joie de vivre to the stage as well. She just seemed kind of happy to be there. I do think, though, that I've heard the argument made a couple places that possibly the biggest winners were the people who were not, in fact, on the stage. So this might include John Huntsman, who I think is in some ways the better Mormon to get into who could get into the race. Just by not being involved in this sort of clown show early on, you save yourself the trouble of gaffes and other kind of vultures picking at the bones like we are today.
Sure. Yeah, I guess that's right. I mean, the issue that I have with Huntsman, and I think that he would be a really formidable candidate, is at this point it seems to me that probably his national name recognition is low enough.
Very low, yeah.
That it seems like it would just be hard to really actually do it this time around. I think that we've finally gotten to the point that you're not going to see a ton more candidates coming in. But had you heard, do you think that he's going to run? Do you think that he's going to step in?
I mean, I certainly have no inside information, but there has been this little kind of uptick of his name appearing on lists, and maybe I'm considering, maybe I'm not. Of course, the other person who wasn't on the stage last night was Gary Johnson, the Governor Gary Johnson, who failed to meet the threshold set by CNN. And he's another guy who I think probably has some name recognition problems, but who could have actually, I think, been at his best in these early debates. So it's a shame that he wasn't there. He's not going to win the nomination, probably, but to have someone on the stage who one of his major issues is the war on drugs, I think would have been valuable, and someone who is a pretty thoroughgoing libertarian without some of Ron Paul's peculiar preoccupations, which he shares with Michelle Bachmann, would have been nice.
So speaking of the war on drugs, it might be a good pivot. Another thing that we were going to talk about was this this huge report released. I don't know who actually released it, because it had this big sort of bipartisan, or this big sort of broad panel of people on it, but I don't know who actually released the report, come to think of it. Basically showing that the war on drugs has failed, and that a number of countries, especially the United States, should rethink their policies about how to approach it. So I guess that's probably like a too cursory summary, but what did you think of it? And
I thought one of the most interesting things about the report was that it sort of presented this incredible litany of damning evidence about how spectacular the failure of the war on drugs has been in all dimensions. And then their conclusions were, okay, probably we should decriminalize weed and start having a discussion, which seemed to me to be, far, far south of what was warranted by what they found. So,
sure.
I mean, they're trying to kind of split the difference between doing something radical and doing something that people would actually see as viable or something worth entering into the public discussion. If they say, cocaine in vending machines is the American way, let's do this thing, no one's gonna pay attention to the report. So I guess
I think that's right. I mean, I think that in the United States, where you're starting to see, because I do think that some sort of tide has maybe started to shift in the U.S. Against decriminalization towards decriminalization and more to the point towards lower sentencing. And so I think that the movement on sentencing has been most interesting, and it's been primarily for fiscal reasons. Right. So, Mitch Daniels in Indiana tried to sort of move a whole bunch of people out of jail and move sentencing guidelines down, and then was prevented from doing so essentially by the prison lobby, is my understanding. And then, sort of there was this sort of backlash of people saying, well, oh no, we can't be tough on, we can't be soft on crime here, and we have to do this. But I do think that you'll see a lot more state efforts, and I think that the federal effort or the national effort, if it comes, will come much later. But it just really does make sense for virtually all states to look at sentencing guidelines, and to look then after that at laws. And so, I know that Connecticut recently had a sort of, I don't think it was decriminalization, but a push to sort of, basically make marijuana offenses much smaller. And so I think you'll start to see that. But I think for a lot of, it's essentially going to be for fiscal reasons. And if that's how it happens, that's totally fine with me. I think it's perfectly good reason to do these things.
And yet I think it's telling that, granted there was limited time and a lot of candidates, but it's not as if this issue is rising to the level of discussion at, for instance, an early Republican primary debate, right?
Sure.
It's easy, I think, for people who are long-term skeptics of the war on drugs or long-term, opponents of the war on drugs to see small signs of hope as being more significant than they are. And I think it's great if, the war on drugs can be recast as a fiscal issue in addition to a moral issue and an issue of sort of fundamental freedoms, because that argument doesn't seem to have been going very far. But at the same time, no mainstream politician is touching this, and I think it's going to be a long time before they do. Even though, you do see things like the wholesale decriminalization of personal use in Portugal and some other places that have had pretty significant success. My biggest concern, though, is that what this report's conclusion, where they kind of focus on decriminalizing marijuana, that if that's what happens first, that a lot of the promised benefits of ending the war on drugs aren't going to accrue, right?
Sure.
If you just decriminalize marijuana, you wind up still with a lucrative black market in all the harder drugs. You still have all the pathologies associated with drug-related crime. The prisons are still pretty full, even if you, and not that decriminalizing marijuana wouldn't be great, but I worry that people who have promised wonderful things for the end of the war on drugs are going to wind up in a tough spot when, politicians turn around 10 years after marijuana is decriminalized and say, how come there are still gangs? How come Mexico is still a mess? And that's going to be a hard question to answer, because the answer is a subtle one.
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely astute, and I think that the fear that marijuana would become a sideshow is probably a perfectly good one. What one would hope would happen is maybe that marijuana is seen as sort of what it is. So, obviously the international trade in it is very troubling, but in terms of the social effects of marijuana users in the United States and marijuana dealers in the United States, it's a very, very different issue than it is for people who are trading in or using hard drugs. And so I think that if you see a bifurcation, it wouldn't necessarily be a bad one, that you could kind of think of marijuana as being sort of separate from these other drugs offenses that have much more deleterious social effects and economic effects in Central America and Mexico, and really significant foreign policy effects that marijuana doesn't have. So if marijuana changes faster than everything else changes and changes differently, I don't necessarily think that would be bad, but I agree with you that, yeah, it will take recognizing that, especially in terms of the more international effects, that there are other drugs that are much more pressing and are going to be much, much harder to solve, and where a lot of the work for solving, the problems from the war on drugs is going to have to come from countries that aren't the United States, even though the United States' policies have obviously been sort of bad and actually kind of hurt the war on drugs in other countries and made things really hard for other countries, especially Mexico. So I think that there's the possibility that kind of separating out marijuana could be a good thing, and at least you do feel like you could get some action on there somewhat more quickly. But I agree with you that there is, kind of like the chance that people will look back and say, well, okay, what have we actually solved by decriminalizing this?
Right, and of course the parallel argument is always just to note that some drugs are already legal, right? Alcohol is already legal, and we have a bunch of pretty well documented problems with alcohol use and abuse in this country, and the existence of legal alcohol does not take a dent out of some of the worst stuff that results from the war on drugs. So, to sort of move weed into the booze category would be great, but I think might actually not get us as far toward a more kind of a broader legalization than some people might like to think. However, there has also been an interesting development in the war on drugs this last couple of weeks, in the form of easy ways to buy them online. There's been a bunch of attention to this site, to this sort of, I guess, online currency, digital currency called Bitcoin. And in particular, there was a story that ran that connected Bitcoin to a site called Silk Road, where you can buy illegal drugs. So the question is this currency actually anonymous, untraceable, and is this website where you can buy illegal drugs something that could continue to exist and thrive? It exists on sort of a parallel internet for, that's not quite right, but it's a simple way to explain it. So it's not something that you can just sort of point your browser to Silk Road and go check it out. It's there's sort of a bunch of hoops you have to jump through that anonymize all the transactions. But Bitcoin, which is a pretty cool company, has suddenly found themselves the targets of kind of politicians who want to make hay out of this, oh my God, you can buy illegal drugs anonymously thing, including Chuck Schumer, who, of course, famously has recently also spearheaded the crackdown on caffeinated alcoholic beverages. So he's really got a lot of strange little sort of small scale moral crusades going on these things.
Yeah, no, exactly. He's saving us from Four Loko and from peer-to-peer currency.
And peer-to-peer currency. Thank God for Senator Chuck Schumer. What would we do without him, right?
Yeah. So I think that your summary of it is exactly right. And it was this story, I think it was Adrian Chen on Gawker who wrote it about Silk Road, which was this site that Lord knows I had never heard of. And it's one of these things that you would imagine exist, but, you know, if you're me and, you know, you don't know that they do. But yeah, so I was initially fascinated by Bitcoin because just, you know, as an idea, I think it's so cool. And I think that there's a lot of interest in alternative currencies and changing currencies right now in the United States, in no small part because of a number of libertarians, including Ron Paul, and because of the Tea Party, who've taken this sort of interest in popularizing the idea or I guess bringing up some of the weaknesses that they have with the dollar, the problems that they have with the dollar, and with the inflation that they think that the Fed is creating. So I got interested in it kind of from an academic standpoint, where it's just this kind of fascinating thing where there's a number of Bitcoins that are going to be created, and they're created algorithmically in this kind of cool way, and people can mine them, but for the most part, you can just trade for them. And there's been enormous volatility in Bitcoin prices. They recently just had this, after the Schumer thing came out, they had this, I'm pretty sure it was right after the Schumer thing came out, they had this sort of dramatic 30% drop in the value of them. And so, yeah, I think as kind of an intellectual, as something to look at intellectually, I think that they're really, really interesting. I would be surprised if Bitcoins are around a year from now, because I don't know how the government would do it, but I know that they will now, put some effort into trying to stop this if they're being used to, kind of trade drugs. And the problem is because of, inherent in Bitcoin's nature, they're not traceable. There isn't a lot of data about them. We don't know what kind of transactions are being performed with them. And I guess that you could probably guess at it. But because, there's no sort of public information about them, we don't know what percentage of Bitcoins are actually being used for sort of illicit transactions, whether it's something that's, barely illicit, in terms of just betting on poker online, to actually really illicit in terms of paying for drugs online. Versus just kind of, common transactions. And my sense is that a lot of transactions are just common, that it's just kind of people who are using them to pay for this, that, or the other online because they kind of think that they're cool. And I think that a lot of them are being held by people who are essentially speculating in them. But we don't know. And I think that that's the issue with Bitcoins, is that because they're secretive, people are going to see them as being sort of like threatening and presume that there's something menacing going on with them. And I think that might, eventually be their downfall. Yeah.
Well, and we've actually been here before, right? I mean, this is in many ways the story of PayPal. Peter Thiel, who's a prominent libertarian and who's actually recently made headlines again for paying people to not go to college, which I think is pretty fascinating. He was obviously one of the founders of PayPal and spoke very early on, and you can read about this in a book that describes the beginnings of PayPal called the PayPal Wars, I think. And he spoke very early on about this goal of having a non-state controlled currency. And he really did have this vision that's similar to the vision that people are discussing with Bitcoin now of, just creating a place where people can quickly, easily, cheaply move their money in and out of various currencies, essentially protecting themselves from the whims of governments, which have control over monetary policy. So what happened there, which is not necessarily completely apparent to the outsider who might still use PayPal, is they basically wound up closing off all of the avenues that made PayPal a possible kind of revolutionary thing, and just saying, fine, eBay, take it, use it for your own purposes. Right. So I think, there is a big difference, which is that Bitcoin is peer-to-peer, it's distributed. So there's not a single choke point where authorities can put pressure the way that they did on PayPal once it was clear that people were using it for stuff like online gambling and other purposes, money laundering. But it wasn't actually, PayPal was pretty big and being used mostly for not illegal things, and that didn't matter. So I almost think it also doesn't matter with Bitcoin. You know, if one person goes into 14 layers of anonymity and manages to buy some LSD online, that's all that matters to Chuck Schumer and people like him. It's you know, a single illegal transaction is enough to say, screw it, we're shutting this thing down. Now, that might be harder with Bitcoin, but I think you're quite right to ultimately be pessimistic about, you know, the future of the company for that reason.
Yeah, and, you know, and I think that you're totally right. I think that what Bitcoin would have to do to remain capable and remain stable, and, you know, I don't know that much about the tech side of this, and I'm not terribly tech savvy, but my understanding is that it is true that it might actually be somewhat impossible to shut Bitcoin down for the government, and that would obviously be good for Bitcoin if they could show that there's no way for the government to kind of interfere with it. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is, I think that if Bitcoin got big enough, if the dollar value of all Bitcoins or the total currency value of all Bitcoins was big enough, and that you could show that there was a legal trade, you know, at some point, obviously the government's problem is not with Bitcoin. Government's problem is with people buying drugs online. And so, you know, it's just that they see Bitcoin as possibly one way to clamp down on this trade in illegal drugs happening on the internet. You know, it could be that because there is nothing illegal about Bitcoin, and this was actually something that I got in a couple of emails after I wrote an article about it, you know, of people being like, wait, well, are people really allowed to mint their own currencies? And the answer is absolutely yes, you just can't mint dollars. Right. You know, I think that if it got to the point that it was big enough and legitimate enough and it was hard enough for the government to crack down on it, it could be fine. I think that the problem is that now there's all this negative press and people are like, oh, Bitcoins are being used for drug transactions and, you know, the government hates it. A reasonable person is not going to say, okay, I'm going to take all of my money and put some of it in Bitcoins. You know, the currency is not going to be easy to use. The currency is not going to feel safe to use. And the currency isn't going to have the sort of stable values that you would expect a currency to have at some point, if not now. And so, you know, I think that people speculating on Bitcoin and even people shorting Bitcoin, again, are probably remaining a lot of the people that are trading in it, but we don't know. And so, you know, I think it's a very cool idea. And I think that you'll continue to see these sorts of currencies going forward. I don't know how you would get it so that it wouldn't, you know, be used for illegal purposes and have a lot of really strong anti-government response. And I don't think it is that the government cares that, you know, again, I think it's just that the government wants to stop the drug transactions as opposed to prevent the currency itself. But
although, don't you think that if it gets, I mean, there is a tipping point, right, that you're describing here, where if it gets big enough that it becomes a kind of legitimate alternative to dollars, at that point, the government interest, I think, would likely change. You know, right now, they just see it as part of the war on drugs, which is sort of the source of so much of strange, dysfunctional government behavior. But if there becomes a point where the U.S. feels that it's losing its grip on the currency used by its citizens, I think, you know, maybe then and only then does the government get really serious about shutting down Bitcoin. And there are ways, you know, I think it's purposely built to be quite resistant, but
sure,
you know, there are always ways.
I just think that for Bitcoin to get to that point, to actually be a competing currency,
sure. I mean, that's a long
you know,
way
it would be so far. And you know, the other thing is, like, the dollar is so big and is so international and is so stable and is so liquid to trade. For Bitcoin to get there, you know, it's some other crazy things that I can't, you know, we would have to be invaded by aliens and all this other stuff would have to go on, I think, before we'd get there. I think it would be much likelier that Bitcoin would, you know, if it were to become a legitimate currency that was used kind of frequently internationally, it could become, because it's really expensive to move money internationally, I could see it as being a way to basically, you know, say that you had relatives in Zimbabwe or in Australia or Japan or whatever it was, and it was actually kind of expensive for you to shift money to them. I could see it becoming, you know, a way to basically move money outside of the transitional banking system so you wouldn't be paying a lot of fees. Something like that. I could even see companies using it if it got stable enough. But there's this kind of catch-22 where it won't be stable enough for people to use it until it's stable enough, and if it never gets there, it's just never going to get there. Right. And I think that that's probably what you'll see with Bitcoin, is it will continue to be this kind of like sort of niche, cool, webby product that you know, I think will be under constant government threat as long as there is even the sort of whiff of illegality about it. And I don't think that they can sort of stamp that whiff of illegality out. Although, I'll be very interested to hear how they're actually going to attempt to sort of shut these transactions down. Yeah. It's kind of, I mean, is Silk Road still functional now? I don't even know.
It's hard to imagine. I mean, what I know I pointed out in some of my blogging and other people have noted as well is, there is this major chink in the armor, which is that the drugs have to go somewhere to a physical place. So, at the very least, that's a place for people to start. There is one other parallel, or there are several other parallels, but there's one other recent parallel to trying to get an alternate currency going, and that's Liberty dollars. Yeah. Which was, I think we can now probably call it a failed experiment. What's interesting to note about that is, you are correct in pointing out that it is not illegal to make your own currency. It's just illegal to make fake dollars. But these coins, which were pretty clearly not masquerading as dollars in any way, but were, I suppose, coins. And so in that way, similar to legit U.S. currency, wound up getting shot down on those grounds, on the grounds that this was somehow, people were trying to counterfeit legit U.S. currency. So even though they had kind of gotten an okay from Treasury to exist, the U.S. Mint was actually the folks who wound up going after them. So I think even when the laws on the books say it's okay to experiment with alternate currencies, there are always ways to work around. And in the case of Liberty dollars, they wound up having their all of their records and all of their coins seized. I think they're still in legal, tied up in legal battles to get them back. But they were seized on the grounds that, like, these are coins and the U.S. has coins, and so we can't allow it. So once you get to that point, there is a kind of blurring of, well, is it really legal to have an alternate currency at all?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of funny. And you do wonder if it's just like, had they called them something other than Liberty dollars, right?
Right. Had they called them Liberty widgets or something. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That they never would have come. Because you got to feel like that was probably like a cool day for the Mint, right? They're like, oh yeah, we're going to get these guys.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Well, and I kind of like the idea somehow.
Tiny currency.
Yeah, I like the idea somehow that, like, there's like a bunch of guys in a room up above. Have you ever done the tour of the Mint? When you come to DC, tourists like to go see the Mint because you see the dollars being run off and the coins being stamped, and it's sort of neat. And I like this idea of some guys, in a room overlooking the factory floor of the Mint being like, this cannot stand. We can be the only ones to print coins. I mean, there's this sort of smoke-filled room feeling about it. Again, weirdly, because they were so small and because, as you suggest with Bitcoin, most of the people who were using them were geeks. They were different kind of geeks, right? This was because it wasn't an online currency, but they were people who just thought it was a cool experiment, mostly. And
yeah, exactly.
Pretty clearly weren't threatening the stability of the U.S. currency.
No, and again, it's, however many trillions of dollars there are, the idea that these currencies are a threat to the dollar or a threat to other currencies is crazy. Probably they're a threat to the people that are holding them in the sense that they could lose a lot of money, and they're a threat in the sense that they could be used for other illegal activity. But again, it's like the illegal activity is the problem, not the currency. And what's kind of funny is that, like, obviously using Bitcoins, I'm sure that it does to a certain extent facilitate these transactions, but they remain just really, really dangerous, and there remain all sorts of hurdles to them. I always think it's a good thing for drug trades to be as difficult as possible. But again, I'm not sure that I would cite Bitcoin as the problem. I think that obviously, criminals have thought of lots of enterprising and creative ways to get around the issue that they can't really wire money to one another. But
and people do have this way of managing to buy drugs with their dollars pretty much all the time. So there's that too. That it's not like, oh, without these currencies, how could people pay for their drugs?
I know, exactly. It's like the econ textbook. They'll be like, I have this bushel of apples.
Yeah. But you have a cow. How can we divide up the cow? Yeah, it's exactly that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm trying to think, what else were we meant to chat about? I find this stuff really fascinating, but I think it'll be really interesting to see how the government actually goes about sort of tackling Bitcoins. Because I don't know, I mean, they must have the tech savvy to do it, but I just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are significant real hurdles. I mean, peer-to-peer is something that, as we've seen with file sharing, as we've seen with copyright issues, it's not easy to crack down on. And you do need a kind of central choke point where you can get people, right. So it's either the ISPs or the bank or whatever it is. But I think it will be an interesting experiment to see kind of government versus technology. I think though one hint of where the way we might see government dealing with this issue is just the recent interest in a lot of other consumer finance issues that I would have thought previously were kind of below the notice of the United States Congress. And of course, I'm talking here about swipe fees, which is something that I know you've written about, and also a bunch of other things, including stuff like payday lending and check cashing fees, where these are kind of small scale financial transactions that are in some ways their own kind of parallel economy. They're kind of their own kind of parallel digital dealings with money, and the Congress has decided that all of this is their business. With the swipe fees, there's been a push to cap the amount that merchants can be charged. So if you pay for something with your credit card or your debit card, they have to kick the store that you paid at has to kick money back to the card company. And now supposedly those fees are going to be capped at 12 cents, although that's still up for debate. So the question is, A, should this be something that is a matter for legislation at all? And B, who would actually benefit if this goes into place? And I think you've written pretty intelligently that maybe the answer is not customers.
Well, I think that you put this really well. For a really long time, the battle over swipe fees was this kind of interesting. It was big retailers versus big banks, and swipe fees. I think it's been fascinating watching these interest groups try and make this a public interest that people are interested in, and they have the ads of the women holding the bag of groceries and, the kind of scary ads in the subway and whatever. It's actually pretty arcane, and it takes like a few seconds even to sort of explain it. But basically, swipe fees are charged not by the banks themselves. They're set by Visa and MasterCard, who have essentially a monopoly over the payment processing network in the United States. And they set those fees, and the banks never say no when they raise them because the banks love the free money. But it's proportional to the size of purchase, and it didn't have a cap on it. And it's usually, I think it's 1.14% of the transaction is the average, but it comes out to about 40 cents. Banks claim that they need this money in order to keep up the payment processing network. And Congress, the Fed did a study and basically said, well, that's not really true. These fees have gotten egregiously high. And the issue is that they're charged not to the consumer, but to the company to the business. So big companies like Walmart would negotiate these fees down directly with the big banks and Visa and MasterCard. But they would create these kind of secret agreements about what to set the fees at, and nobody really knew. There was not a lot of transparency there. Small businesses felt like they were just getting kind of a little bit squeezed on this because the fees got higher and higher and higher for them, to the point that they weren't making any money on small transactions. And the strangest thing about all of this is that this applies only to debit transactions and not to credit transactions. And there are different fees for credit transactions. And again, those payment processors are forever taking some small amount out of the purchase fee and taking it from the business that's selling. But so, for a long time, this was just a business versus business and big business versus big business battle, where you have retailers on one side and banks on the other, with Visa and MasterCard kind of in the middle. And so do I think that Congress should be necessarily I don't think that swipe fees were as big a deal as some people make them out to be. I don't think that necessarily this legislation should have been was needed per se, but it was this kind of funny thing where businesses didn't have enough leverage to get, because consumers were never sort of interested in this, even though it was consumers who ultimately were paying the fees. There was no competition here. There was nobody who could step in and say, okay, well, our fees are lower. Merchants, you should accept us, because it was all a matter of whose card was paying for what. And so, because the market wasn't really working, I think that was why eventually Congress did step in. So I think that the legislation is fine. I don't think it's a huge deal one way or another, although other people are very, very sort of incensed and interested in the matter. But you seem, at least, so do you think that Congress should have just never gotten involved?
Well, I mean, I think it's the phrase that you just used there, whether or not the market is working. And I think as a writer for Reason Magazine and Libertarian, I have always alarm bells that go off when people say, oh, this is market failure, the market's not working, that's why government had to step in. And I think in this case, that's not really true. That it is true that there are some big players and some little players, and so there's an imbalance of power. But, we've all seen how little players deal with this problem, right? How many times have you been in a bodega where there's a little sign up that says minimum credit card charge $10?
Yeah.
That's a pretty good solution. I mean, the merchants ultimately do have total discretion about when they do and don't accept these cards. They have full information. They know exactly what the fees are, and they know, to some extent that other people, that for instance, Walmart's fees are lower. They might not know exactly how low, but so I think, this is something where if you genuinely believe, and I have no reason not to believe that the fees were getting too high in some sense, that they were getting sort of notably, annoyingly high. Every small merchant in the country had a remedy, which was to simply reduce the use of cards for certain transactions. And if that took too much of a dent out of their sales, because people do use cards more and more, and debit cards in particular more and more for these transactions, then they could go back to accepting them. And the fee is the cost of doing business. So I guess it's not clear to me why this isn't something that eventually comes into balance, that merchants should pay for the services they receive from these card companies and ultimately banks. And they can pass the cost on to customers, or they can take the hit, and that's up to them. I mean, if you want customers to care about this issue, and there are lots of people who do, there's also always the option of more transparency. I've seen, I would say increasingly, those little signs that say minimum credit card charge $10 sometimes now say something like, because fees are too high. And this is also why some places don't take American Express, right? My understanding is that, again, this is different debit versus credit, but sort of parallel issue that American Express's fees are higher. I think just because there is a problem doesn't mean government should solve it. That's a pretty simple kind of idea. And you can kind of boil down everything to that in virtually every political discussion, I think. But in particular, I think this problem isn't very dire. We're talking about, 44 cents versus 12 cents. And we're talking about people who really do have a lot of choices about how they respond to the existence of that fee.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with you that this, this got made out to be, sort of an epic issue. And I think that part of the reason that it became such a big deal is that the lobbying effort between big retailers and big banks on the Hill has just been massive over this. It has been absolutely huge. And I think that's why it's gotten so much attention here, is that actually, I think it was Ryan Grimm and Zach Carter at the Huffington Post had a great story about the lobbying battle and how legislators didn't even know what really to do and how to pick a side on this, because the lobbying was so intense from both sides. And the big business lobby and the big banks lobby are obviously, they're strong lobbies, needless to say. They're really going head to head in this kind of confusing debate in which it wasn't totally clear what Congress's position should be. I agree with you that I don't think that this is specifically the end of the world. I think that what is perhaps most interesting for me in this is if you're going to finger exactly what the problem is, like why the market is perhaps not working as well as it should be here, the issue is that Visa and MasterCard have essentially a monopoly. And so they had monopolistic pricing power. And so even if you were to negotiate, those negotiations were basically happening in secret. And I think that now there's been a lot of really radical innovation to reduce Visa and MasterCard's monopoly as payment processors. And Visa and MasterCard are fighting it really, really hard. I don't know if you've ever heard about, the digital wallets or, how Google is now stepping into the payment processing space, and PayPal is trying to become more of a competitive company than it had been for a couple years. I think this is going to be great for consumers, especially because Visa and MasterCard are really reacting to this and are offering more innovation to consumers and are also reducing prices. So, for instance, people were trying to make peer-to-peer transactions. So if I wanted to send you, as opposed to Bitcoins, to just send you dollars, and we both had Visa cards, we can now just do that for free on our cell phones because Visa saw that there was, a little bit of innovation in that space and they decided to step up to it.
Right.
But, in the actual case of swipe fees, it was clear that because Visa and MasterCard do retain this enormous, basically, monopoly over payments processing, that they weren't going to reduce fees, and they were happy to set them as high as the banks were. So I think that's kind of one interesting facet. The other thing is, I just worry that inevitably banks are going to make this money up somehow. And they had these kind of interesting ads basically promising consumers that they were going to see their ATM fees go up because the banks would have no choice, which, it's fine. And you can choose your bank based on what their fees are. And they are required to be very transparent about them. But so, I agree with you that this is like kind of an interesting proxy battle and an interesting way to look at, these kind of big banking, sort of the background to all of the transactions that we make that you don't look at very often.
Right. And this is also something that we saw last year in the debate about overdraft fees, where banks basically said, you know what, no problem, make overdraft fees illegal or make them harder to charge because they didn't actually make them illegal, make them harder to charge. That's cool. We'll just get rid of free checking. No problem. And that's like, that's a reality that, banks aren't going to say, oh, well, you know what, Congress, that was a really good point. Although actually I think the overdraft thing wasn't Congress, it was a bureaucratic thing. But, that's a really good point. We probably shouldn't make so much profit. We'll stop. That's not realistic. So, then you do have to ask, as you should ask with all legislation, what are the other consequences of this going to be? What's going to happen? And stuff like the disappearance of free checking and similar tweaks so that the banks can make up their money, ATM fee increases so the banks can make up their money elsewhere are pretty much inevitable. But I think your point about the fact that Visa now allows peer-to-peer exchange, basically because of competition from PayPal, is something it's just that point is not made enough. Right?
Yeah.
5 years ago or 10 years ago, there's no way out. You can't see a way out of people would like to be able to exchange money with each other without using actual cash, and there's no way to do it. But lo and behold, technology changes. New things come along. Competition comes from weird places that you wouldn't expect. Google, and everyone changes their behavior. So I think often the cry of monopolistic pricing power is too soon and too alarmist, given how often so-called monopolies fall from competition from completely unexpected places.
Yeah, and I do think, I don't think that you're quite seeing it yet. I think that it remains that in the realm of consumer finance, that consumers get, I wouldn't describe it as a raw deal on basic checking and savings accounts, but I don't think that companies are as competitive as they can be. And again, I think that there's a lot of webby alternatives that are really trying to change that, and hopefully will goad these big banks into forcing to compete on price. I'm not bemoaning the loss of free checking at all. I think that when you had a free checking account, you were always paying for it somehow, and generally you were paying for it through hidden fees, or not hidden fees, but fees that you didn't recognize. So, you would overdraft once or twice by 12 cents, and your bank wouldn't stop the transaction and prevent it from going through. They would just let it happen, and all of a sudden you'd have $70 in charges. That would basically be the way that you would pay for the cost of your checking account for a year.
Right. Although I actually do think it's worth noting there, there is a question of, okay, so who would we rather have pay for the cost of supporting these checking accounts, right?
Right.
And right now they're saying, okay, well, listen, we're just going to make everybody pay. You're going to have to pay a fee to hold, to have a checking account, or you're going to have to keep a minimum balance, which is basically the same thing. Whereas before, people who were doing stuff that they could have avoided that wasn't optimal, they were the ones who were paying. And then people who were being responsible got this nice free checking account. So, there is that too, which is definitely a side point. But someone's going to pay. Who's it going to be?
And so similarly, again, another one of the reasons that I'm just not bemoaning the loss of free checking is I would rather have everybody pay $5 a year for a checking account than, the problem was that was basically, and this was something that, I my, kind of lefty credentials was concerned about, it was basically poor people who were paying for rich people's free checking. If you're poor and you didn't have a lot of money in your account, or you're a college student, or you're just not terribly financially literate, your fees ended up being much, much, much higher.
But that's not actually true. I mean, sorry to interrupt, but that's not actually true. Poor people who were getting hit with these fees were paying mostly for other poor people or lower middle class people's checking accounts, because rich people pay for their own checking accounts. They keep a lot of money in them, and the bank invests that money and makes money.
Poor and rich are probably like not the right words to be using there.
But I mean, they're very loaded. I mean, those are really loaded words, and that argument was made a lot in this overdraft debate, and it's being made to some extent with the swipe fees thing too. And I think it's actually pretty important to point out that rich people are operating, on a kind of entirely separate system, and even middle class people, not Bill Gates type people, are still kind of paying, quote unquote, paying for their own accounts in a different mechanism.
Yeah, well, take out the terms poor and rich, because those probably are not useful here. But I do think that there was some sort of like regressive benefits that were, basically being accrued from people who tended to have less money in their accounts to people who had more. I also think that on the other end, on the higher end that you're talking about, from people who do, quote unquote, pay for their own accounts, in other ways, the rise of things like signature debit and a bunch of other sort of rewards cards has been somewhat pernicious, because a lot of times, those benefits get paid for by fees who are paid for by other folks. And I don't think that there's like necessarily a philosophical problem with this. Again, I think that businesses should, basically be allowed to run how they should be run. But it was, from a consumer financial perspective, a little bit worrying. And so that's, again, part of the reason that I prefer the transparency and the sort of equality of having everybody pay for a checking account, as opposed to having this kind of like other sort of backgrounded fee structure in which it wasn't clear who was paying for what.
Right. Although this gets us back, I think, to in some ways where we started, which is that this whole thing is very not transparent. That the way that our very elaborate, non-cash money exchange works in this country is something that basically no one understands. And so there are places here and there where you might have a particular objection, but the swipe fees thing is a great example. No one really understands the role of banks versus credit companies versus merchants, big merchants and small merchants, even people who do have strong views on this issue. So to sort of somehow think that, for instance, the fact that free checking is being paid for by overdraft fees is like annoyingly non-transparent seems a little odd to me in the context of this incredibly non-transparent system, which I think isn't a problem, because mostly it gives people what they want and it works. And nobody's being defrauded. Nobody's being lied to. It's just complex. And so people don't, people are rationally ignorant of how these things work.
Yeah, I do think that that's true. And again, I think that there's like, certainly I would posit that the way that our basic banking structure, it absolutely does work, and you can argue for more or less transparency, but I don't think that, it's certainly not a fraudulent system or anything like that. I think more transparency is always good, and I think that more fee transparency is always good, especially because it allows for easier competition between these firms, and because it is so complicated. The more that you can look and say, okay, reasonably, which of these fees am I going to be paying, and therefore which bank is right for me, and can I get them to compete for my business, is probably always, is obviously always a good thing.
So we've basically gone from Bitcoin, which is pretty awesome because it's almost completely non-transparent, to banking, where we'd like to see a little more transparency. But yeah. These perform different functions. So, well, it has been great talking to you, Annie, on this day after this hangover day from the first Republican debate, and I'm pleased that we managed to make it through the entire Blogging Heads without mentioning one special man who has dominated the news cycle. Should we just leave it at that?
I think so.
All right.
I think I have nothing to say about it. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Katherine, and have a good day.
It was great talking to you.
Okay. Bye-bye.